Welcome to episode 3 of this read-along book club of Jeff Vandermeer's Annihilation. We are talking about chapter 3, Immolation, and immolation is an interesting word. I've talked about it a little bit earlier, but I don't think I defined it. And it's really, it's death by burning, right? It's losing one's identity, one might say. And we had an interesting little discussion, or I should say note that somebody brought up on the Discord server, which reminds me, if you're not already there, you should totally join. We're having a fantastic discussion on the channel dedicated to Annihilation. But I would also love to hear your comments down below, or your thoughts in the comments down below. This individual, he said that, isn't it interesting that there is a deeper theme going on with this book, and it's about kind of a loss of identity. And I think what clued him in first was the fact that none of these people were allowed to use their names. They were only allowed to use their professions. You know, at the beginning, I thought it was a lot about mind games that the Southern Reach was doing to these people. It was a sense of control. It was a sense of, destroying or removing all kind of agency that they had. And now it's even making more sense as the biologist. She's infected with these spores. And chapter 3 is really the turning point. It's the midpoint, if you will, for you writer nerds out there. You'll know that the midpoint in storytelling is when there's a revelation of some kind. There's a shift of some kind. It's right at the very peak of the story. One might say the midpoint, where if you're leading up to a certain area, you're tumbling down the other side of the mountain into the climax, or it could be a tragic ending or a happy ending. I'll let you guess as to what the ending of this book is going to be, but I really hope you're reading this carefully, because the one thing I'm noticing even more and more, talking with you out there as well about it, is that Jeff Vandermeer's word selection is incredibly precise. You don't see this in much fiction. Much fiction I read. This is a shorter novel, but it is incredibly packed with just juicy goodness. There's so much symbolism. There's so much meaning to a lot of these words. More so than what they are on the page, as far as like your standard description or your definition of what's trying to get you to communicate. What he's trying to say. I know this is kind of rambly, but I think it's important. It's important to talk about, because that's another reason why this book is so special to me. It's not just surface level stuff. It's not just about these people going into onto an alien landscape and finding a strange structure, traveling to a lighthouse. It's so much more than that. It's such a deeper exploration of character, loss, trauma, and so much more I'm probably not talking about. But let's get into this thing, shall we? Because, like I said, the midpoint is a dramatic shift in storytelling, and that's exactly what we have here. We have the biologist. She's literally telling us, okay, this is why I'm saying you guys really need to pay attention to this stuff. And there's some of you out there, A+, you guys are paying close attention. You're even showing me things that I completely missed. So now a strange mood took hold of me as I walked silent and alone through the last of the pines and the cypress knees. I was hiking near some cypress today, so I got some or not today, but the other day, and I got some very interesting Area X vibes. Let us say there was also a lighthouse out there. Knees that seemed to float in the black water, the gray moss that coated everything. It was as if I traveled through the landscape with the sound of an expressive and intense aria. Aria, it's a song, like a choir-like voice, playing in my ears. Everything was imbued with emotion, awash in it. Almost heavenly, you might say, almost spiritual. She's having almost a spiritual experience right here. She even calls a thing in her chest a brightness. And I was no longer a biologist, but somehow I was no longer a biologist. But somehow the crest of a wave building and building, but never crashing to shore. I saw it with such new eyes and subtleties, etc., etc., etc. Beautiful descriptions of this landscape, and it's really conveying her change, her shift, her sacrifice, how her immolation, you might say. And technically there's no fire, but anyway, it goes on and on and on and on and on. Beyond the lighthouse stood, and before that I knew the remains of I knew the remains of a village. She knew the remains of a village. So she's becoming more and more one with this thing. Granted, she had the map as well, but you can see all of this beautiful description is not just Jeff Vandermeer flexing his prose skills. It's the biologist. This is a deep POV, first-person account of a biologist recounting her experiences, how she feels. But the great thing about it is he, or she, in the case of the biologist, She is telling us all of this stuff, how she's changing, how she's not herself anymore. If you just see the words, but it doesn't feel like she's telling us literally. She's begging us, or Jeff Vandermeer, I should say, because he wrote this, is begging us to look a little bit closer. And it's such an ironic thing, because what does she do? She talks about later she is fixated by looking at these tide pools and stuff, and just could be there all day long. And Jeff Vandermeer is like saying, hey, stop, slow down, read carefully, look at this stuff, almost as if you are the biologist observing this strange phenomenon. But to consider those elements found inside of the tower as part of a vast biological entity that might or might not be terrestrial. Okay, so here she is starting to finally question things a little bit more. An organism was writing living words along the interior wall of the tower, and may have been doing so for a very long time. This is what she is referring to as the crawler. So she has now separated the tower from some entity that is writing this stuff. For example, the spores I'd inhaled, which pointed to a truthful seeing. It's very spiritual, right? We have these biblical sounding, almost a sermon or scripture on the walls. She has a brightness in her chest. That's the only way she can describe it. She's going through a transformation. So much good stuff. Resistant to this hypnotic suggestion, of course, but if the process had been more complex, what if, by whatever means, the tower emanated an effect too? So not only is she thinking that it's the spores that are affecting her, but just being in proximity to this tower is having some kind of effect. What role did the crawler, italicizes when she names it, serve? What was the purpose of the physical recitation of the words? We do not know. We still do not know at the end of this chapter. Were the words a form of symbiotic or parasitic communication between the crawler and the tower? Which brought me back to the words. Where lies the strangling fruit that came from the hand of the sinner? This might explain the seemingly random nature of the words. It was just building material. Perhaps words didn't matter because it was a process of fertilization. I think this is when she's really going deep into biology. She's flexing her biology muscles. Well, Jeff Vandermeer is anyway. And he mentioned in interviews that there is a wildlife preserve where he lives, and it really gave him a lot of inspiration for this book. So there's a lot of similarities there. I highly suggest you go check them out on YouTube. I think I'm pretty sure there's a lot of video interviews where he covers this. She's equating this to something even stranger, and that being fertilization. But I had to assume, or thought I did, that the crawler didn't just live in the tower. It went far afield to gather the words, and it had to assimilate them. That's what she's talking about. It's almost pollinating. It's bringing these words, attaching them to the tower. And now the lighthouse had finally gotten larger on the horizon. So she is headed off to the lighthouse to go try to find perhaps the psychologist and get shot. That's what she's thinking anyway. But Area X, before the ill-defined event, in caps, or capitalized, that locked it behind the border 30 years ago and made it subject to many inexplicable occurrences, had been part of a wilderness that lay adjacent to a military base. And they tended to be the tight-lipped descendants of fisherfolk, the people who lived around there. So that gave me a very strong impression of The Shadow over Innsmouth by H.P. Lovecraft. And if you're not familiar, it's about this, it's a fishing town, and they become afflicted with some kind of elder being that lives off in the sea, and they begin to transform slowly. So it's got to be a reference. But their disappearance might have seemed to some a simple intensifying of a process begun generations before. When Area X first appeared, there was vagueness and confusion. Not many people knew that it exists. The government's version of events emphasized a localized environmental catastrophe stemming from experimental military research. And within a year or two, it had become the province of conspiracy theorists and other fringe elements. So even though the government admitted to this thing happening, it quickly just kind of faded away to the public eye, or in the public eye, I should say. And it's kind of interesting to think about, because it's a big thing, but I guess it's changing so slowly that it doesn't seem like this looming danger. Or maybe they just lost interest because something else was on the horizon. But during training, we were told that the first expedition went in 2 years after the event. They found what some might call a preternatural silence. I love that description. I felt as if I were both freer than ever before and more constrained. I felt as if I could do anything as long as I did not mind being watched. What the hell does that mean? That's kind of creepy and crazy. We never saw their journals. Instead, they offered them up accounts and long recorded interviews. So We do know, though, the biologist finds the journals. It's such a great, this, again, favorite chapter so far. I love it. It's such an introspective chapter. There's nobody else but the biologist. Well, except the end, a little bit. It did not matter what we knew or we didn't know. Experience told our superiors that few, if any of us, would be coming back. So this is answering some questions as to the perceived carelessness of these expeditions. It's more like they send people out there and knowing they're not going to come back, and then maybe sending another expedition in there to record some things. Perhaps they'll glean information that way. They're giving them old guns. They're giving them crappy supplies. They're stripping their names away from them. This is definitely a suicide mission in their eyes anyway. The deserted village had so sunk into the natural landscape of the coast that I did not see it until I was upon it. So finally, she's making her way closer, moving onto the lighthouse. The remains of chairs and tables, as child's toys, rotted clothing, ceiling beams brought to earth, covered in moss and vines. But I also saw a few peculiar eruptions. I really love this word because to me, it reminds me of the scene when they find the body in the pool area in the film. And it feels like an eruption of something, like there's a body and something erupted from it. But of moss or lichen, rising 4 or 5 feet tall, misshapen, the vegetative matter forming an approximation of limbs and heads and torsos. So this is weird. It's like it's trying to create human forms with this vegetation. Or were they people that turned into these things? We may never know. I was startled to see the sudden double line crossing down the canal toward me, cutting through the water. So finally, this is the first time outside of the tower, I should say, that there's been any, well, I guess there was a wild boar too, but any kind of other creature coming at the biologist, at anyone really. But they are dolphins. Dolphins breach. But what is strange about these dolphins? Well, then something more wrenching occurred. As they slid by, the nearest one rolled slightly to the side, and it stared at me with an eye that did not, in that brief flash, resemble a dolphin eye to me. It was painfully human, almost familiar. Familiar as in her husband, perhaps? I don't know. So this is when we're finally getting a sense of transformation. Because we see a dolphin with a human eye. There's 2 of them. I'm not sure what that means. That's pretty damn weird, right? A dolphin with a human eye. So finally, we're getting stronger hints as to maybe what is going to happen. It was almost noon by the time I reached the lighthouse, so finally she has made it. Up close to give the strong appearance of having been converted into a fortress, a fact conveniently left out of our training. She noticed an approximately, so this is when she's finding walls there. It looks like there's again, fortifications for defense. Something was attacking this lighthouse. That is at least what she believes. Even there are crenellations for rifles. But it appeared that some past offenders of the lighthouse had been at war with the sea, because we have this wall, we have this dune, and then it's facing the ocean, and something is coming from the ocean to fight them. And it is mentioned in a journal entry later on, but I won't get ahead of myself. But someone had tried very hard to keep the others out. This is her going into the lighthouse. A large irregular hole led to the lighthouse's front door. That door had exploded inward, and only fragments of wood clung to the rusted hinges. A purple flowering vine, interesting, had colonized the lighthouse wall and curled itself around the remains of the door on its left side. So this door, something had burst through this door. We have no idea what that is yet, but something made its way in. They were battling this thing on the inside as well, but there were no chairs. The tiles of the floor were covered in dirt and debris, so it's empty, it's quiet. And some of the tables were full of bullet holes, and others appeared half melted or shredded by gunfire. But someone too had carved their initials into one of the tables. RS was here. I hope we find out who that is. I don't remember, even though I've read this book before. It was a strange ascent in contrast to my descents into the tower. So finally, we're getting parallel, another parallel. She's talking about descent, ascent. What is the link? And we do find more of the scripture writing on the wall, but also more bloodstains. Here we go. Words had been written on these walls, but nothing like the words in the tower. Okay, I said something too soon. But some longer hints of what might have transpired. So 4 boxes of foodstuffs. They're making notes about what supplies they have left. But here's something interesting she finds. A crucifix that looked like it had been dislodged from the wall. Why is that interesting? Well, I've already mentioned that these strange words in the tower, they read like scripture. So could be a connection, maybe, maybe not. We'll find out. And worst of all, a dilapidated toy rabbit with ragged ears. Worst of all, why did she say this? Well, probably because she notes as well, there had been no children in Area X since the border had come down as far as I knew. So that is kind of haunting because, you know, you approach this lighthouse and there's signs of battle, there's guns everywhere, there's bloodstains. And when you see a child's toy, it brings kind of just this haunting image of a poor kid there. But maybe we'll find out. Maybe we won't. A faded photograph in a broken frame. Here we go. Dangling from a nail, the smudged glass was cracked and half covered in specks of green mold. The black and white photograph showed two men standing at the base of the lighthouse, with a girl off to the side. A circle had been drawn with a marker around one of the men. And this, she assumes that he is the lighthouse keeper. She describes him, and she just has this feeling, even though it's not indicated as such, or he is not indicated as such. But as I left the landing, I had the peculiar thought that I was not the first to pocket the photo. Why is that? That someone would always come behind to replace it, to circle the lighthouse keeper again. That's weird. That makes this whole thing feel cyclical. I don't know what she means by that or what she feels by that, but I think that's one thing I really love about this book as well, is that fiction, right? Is that we have to communicate things in a way where we understand what's going on most of the time, not all the time, clearly right here. And what's great about this is it's a first-person account of this woman's, the biologist's experience, and I love how she's recording just how she feels. She doesn't give us any context. She doesn't tell us why she knows these things because she has some kind of vision of it or anything like that. It's a feeling. It helps so much with the atmosphere in this book, and that's why I love it so much. He doesn't over-explain. He doesn't under-explain, at least in my opinion. I know some people aren't a huge fan of the way he's going about this book. But the mustiness gave way to the scent of sweat, but also a smell like soap. Interesting smell as she ascends to the very top. She looks around and you can see for miles on all sides. So she takes a moment to just gaze at where she's come from. But she could see strands of black smoke coming from, which could have meant anything, but she is not disturbed by that. But I also could see from the location of the tower a kind of brightness on its own. A brightness, there's that word again. A sort of refracted phosphorescence that did not bear thinking about. Here we go. There's more unsaid. Well, said but unsaid. I thought to pull back the rug. She finds this rug on the floor. A square trapdoor measuring about 4 feet per side lay hidden there. Secret trapdoor. The psychologist had clearly been here. Oh man, for her knapsack, several weapons, bottles of water, and a large flashlight lay off to the left side. So this is cool. This is when she finds this heap. Well, let's just read it, shall we? She finds a mound that dominated the space, a kind of insane midden. Midden is another word that I'm pretty sure Jeff Vandermeer wants you to look up because I didn't know what it meant. It's a pile of refuse or a dunghill, which is interesting considering what is a dunghill? It is the excrement of an animal. So what does that mean in the case of Area X? Well, I think there's all kinds of subtext there. He uses a lot of very biological words in place where you could say a pile of something or just keep it at a mound, but he uses that specific word midden, which evokes such great imagery, symbolism, subtext. And I was looking at a pile of papers with hundreds of journals on top of it, just like the ones we had been issued to record our observations of Area X, each with a job title written on the front, each, as it turned out, filled with writing, many, many more than could possibly have been filled by only 12 expeditions. So here we go. This is when even more lies have been dispelled, right? She realizes that I'm not the 12th expedition. There's been many more. What does the 12th expedition mean? Are they segments of 12? Who knows? And so this really kind of rocks her world. But can you really imagine what it was like in those first moments, peering down into that dark space and seeing that? Perhaps you can. Perhaps you're staring at it now. She is talking to us, like you. She's saying you. That's cool. I really love this final paragraph here because she's taking a moment to pause and consider it. And she's breaking the fourth wall, peering down. Can you imagine? Can you imagine what this might look like? And seeing that, this crazy midden of all of these journals, perhaps you can. Perhaps you're staring at it now. That's cool. That takes you into the story, that brings you into the story. That is such a great thing that you rarely see in novels because it's sort of, usually frowned upon to break the fourth wall. And to my knowledge, she only does it once. And I don't even remember this the first time I read it, but that's so great because that's asking us. I mean, I know I'm wearing a Southern Reach t-shirt like I work for them. If you haven't noticed, that's what this is. I got this online. You can't get it anymore, unfortunately. Otherwise, it might be a giveaway prize. But anyway, Vandermeer is bringing us into the story. He is bringing his world into our world, and it's I love it. I'm sure you can tell I love it as much as I'm talking about it. My third and best field assignment out of college required that I travel to a remote location on the western coast. So this is another flashback with a biologist where she's talking about this 2-year assignment she had. It was a government grant, and it gives us again a deeper look, about who she is, how her husband called her ghost bird. And normally I'd be bored to tears with stuff like this because it's all exposition, but for some reason, because it's a first person account, it feels more real versus reading it like, in a third person narrative. It's also the isolation, I think, because the settings that Vandermeer chooses here, they're not populated very highly at all. I mean, again, the only person we're ever dealing with this entire chapter is the biologist, at least in the present, well, past present. I lived in a village of about 300 souls near the coast. Kind of another parallel, right? Because she does know there was a small village where Area X is now. At low tide in the morning, I would photograph those tidal pools, take measurements, and catalog the life found within them, sometimes staying through part of the high tide, wading in my rubber boots. A species of mussels found nowhere else lived in those tidal pools, in a symbiotic relationship with a fish called a gardener, after its discoverer. But I marveled at the fact that I had been given such a gift, not just to lose myself in the present moment so utterly, but also to have such solitude, which is all I had ever craved during my studies, my practice to reach this point. So, this is another thing that Vandermeer is pointing out to us. This has got some serious subtext here, guys. I've talked about this as well on the server because we've had some great chats about the biologist and just believability and authenticity. But here he is telling us again, a gift. She feels she's been given a gift, not just to lose herself in the present moment, okay? So utterly, but also to have such solitude. She's by herself right now. She wants this. She wants to lose herself, to lose her identity in Area X. That's exactly what's happening. So even way back then, this is something she wanted. Vandermeer's telling us right here. And I know I keep repeating this over and over again, but I think it's important because I don't think a lot of people, they're not reading it that way. And sometimes I'm reading it, I feel like I'm reading it pretty damn carefully, that it almost sounds like he's repeating these things too often. But I'm very surprised that I don't remember picking any of this stuff up the first time I read it. And I haven't really talked to many people yet who've been talking about it at this kind of depth. Well, a few of you guys out there have definitely pointed out some things I haven't even noticed, which is fantastic. But against my better judgment, I began to spend more and more time in the pub. Oh, that's just the old biologist. She's been here for ages going crazy studying those mussels. She talks to herself, mutters to herself at the bar. And if you say a kind word, ... So this is kind of, these are the people around her observing her, and she imagines herself as this old crazy lady. Old crazy lady, like she is right now in Area X perhaps. When I saw those hundreds of journals, I felt for a long moment that I had become that old biologist after all. That's how the madness of the world tries to colonize you. I love his use of colonization there. From the outside in, forcing you to live by its reality. Come on. Tell me that's not subtext of her going to Area X. She is going into this place. The outside is transforming her, forcing her to live in its reality, which doesn't really make a lot of sense, right? We have dolphins with human eyes. We have strange plants growing with people in people shapes. We have a weird wall where it seems like soldiers were defending the lighthouse against some threat from the sea. It's crazy. And this is when she's talking about her husband. So my husband began to call me the ghost bird, which was his way of teasing me for not being present enough in his life. All of my hobbies were bound up by my work. I lived for the work, and I thrilled with the power of that focus. Focus, keyword, guys. But it was also deeply personal. So you can see here that she's not just obsessed with her work, just being isolated, being just staring at these biological things by herself for hours upon hours upon hours. She's obsessed with it, but it's also deeply personal. So we can see that her professional life, what she's doing is really just a metaphor for how she feels about herself, how she views her own life. And I hope you can see how great this book is. Even if you don't like it as much as I do, I really hope you can appreciate the craftsmanship that Vandermeer is putting with these words here, because it's a very short book, but he's saying so much. But fun for me was sneaking off to peer into tidal pools, see, to grasp the intricacies of the creatures that live there. So a lot of people were wondering why she was doing crazy stuff early on. Hopefully you can see. Hopefully you can see. Now, this is separate from all of the crazy shit she's already experienced in Area X, like breathing in the spores, being in this location where she's feeling connected. She's feeling a brightness in her chest. There's a transformation happening. So you have that, Area X, added to her just obsession and the way her mind works. I don't see how you can question her motivations, question what she's doing, what she's thinking, how she's approaching things, because to me, it's crystal clear. Observation had always meant more to me than interaction. See what I'm talking about? Repetition. If you're not reading this carefully, I mean, he keeps telling us. It's almost as if he's like, man, I don't think they're going to believe this biologist does this stuff, or they're not going to buy it. And some of you out there, I know you don't buy it, but he's constantly reminding us, she's telling us how she is, why she's doing things. And this is I love this passage here. This is, she's remembering her husband speaking to her. Ghost bird, do you love me? He whispered once in the dark before he left for his expedition training, even though he was the ghost. Ghost bird, do you need me? I loved him, but I didn't need him. And I thought that was the way it was supposed to be. A ghost bird might be a hawk in one place, a crow in another, depending on the context. The sparrow that shot up into the blue sky one morning might transform mid-flight into the osprey the next. This was the way of things here. There were no reasons so mighty that they could override the desire to be in accord with the tides and the passage of seasons and the rhythms underlying everything around me. Okay, guys, that's heavy stuff. I love that passage because it's such a great reflection of their relationship, how she feels about their relationship. The fact that they're together, but she doesn't need him. She loves him. She's literally changing. She's saying, one moment I'm this, one moment I'm that. I'm literally a ghost bird. The journals and other materials formed a moldering pile. Moldering is another word that you've probably seen often here. Jeff Vandermeer is going to continue to use that word, which means just decay, but very appropriate. And I love this line too. Beetles and silverfish tended to those archives. I love the anthropomorphizing or personification there. The scene obliquely embodied the scrap of writing I had encountered on the tower wall, the seeds of the dead to share with the worms that gather in the darkness and surround the world with the power of their lives. So she's digging through all of these journals finally, trying to find out what it all means. And also a sensation I can in hindsight attribute to the brightness growing within me of a presence pressing up from below, impinging on the edges of my senses. Man, what does that mean? I picked around the edges at first, those journals at random. How many expeditions had really come across the border? She starts just asking all these questions. I came across pages that described unspeakable acts that I still cannot bring myself to set down in words. Entries that mentioned periods of remission and cessation, followed by flare-ups and horrible manifestations. See, so great. He's not giving us all of the details. He's not giving us, well, he does give us a snippet of a journal entry, but nothing so specific as to what this stuff generally means. He's giving these horrible words, horrible manifestations, flare-ups. What does this all mean? And that's so much better than telling us everything. He's giving us enough to have our imaginations go wild, at least mine is. One journal half destroyed by the damp focused solely on the qualities of a kind of thistle with a lavender blossom that grew in the hinterlands between forest and swamp. After a while, a kind of unease came over me as I began to perceive a terrible presence hovering in the background of these entries. I saw the crawler. Remember, this is the creature, the entity that she is separating from the, that she thinks is like fertilizing or pollinating this tower. I saw the crawler or some surrogate approaching in that space just beyond the thistle, and the single focus of the journal keeper a way of coping with that horror. I love this stuff. It's the way to do horror. To me, in my mind, this is perfection. This is modern Lovecraft embodied, because she's describing these situations in such an abstract way, but it's mysterious. It's the unknown, right? It evokes this strangeness, and I think that's so applicable or so appropriate, because that's where we are. We're in Area X, where it's just where nothing really makes sense. And this is when she finds notes of building a wall, which clearly meant the fortification facing the sea. 3 words leapt out at me: repelling an attack. But the assault had come from the sea, and left 4 of us dead. And this is when she actually reads the journal entry to us in more detail. The desolation comes from the sea again, along with the strange lights and the marine life that a high tide batters itself against our wall. At night now, their outliers try to creep in through the gaps in our wall defenses. Still we hold, but our ammunition is running out. Morale is low. Not everything that happens to us, not everything that is happening to us has a rational explanation. There you go. Even in the journal entries, Vandermeer is saying, don't try to overanalyze this stuff. It's inexplainable. It's irrational. It doesn't make sense. I love the way he described this thing. It is exactly what you should be doing. So he's talking about this, some kind of thing, the desolation, whatever the hell that means, in the context of this, along with the strange lights and the marine life that a high tide batters itself against our wall. So it's not just this desolation thing. It's these weird lights. It's all of the sea life kind of just joining together to try to break through this wall. Man, I love it because it just, again, it makes my imagination go wild, which is exactly what you should be doing in horror. But I found what I was looking for more in the journals than I would have expected. And usually it was the beginning phrase, "Where lies the strangling fruits that come from the hand of the sinner? I shall bring forth the seeds of the dead to share with the worms." And here we go. Text in a logbook that reads as if it came out of the Old Testament, but it's from no psalm I remember. So even the people before her are seeing the parallels of the Bible. I was also aware that I would have to go back to base camp before nightfall to remain at the lighthouse. So finally, so we don't realize. So she got there, I think it was around noon or afternoon, and now she's like, "Oh shit, I've discovered all this creepy stuff. I got to go back to base camp or stay here. What the hell do I do?" But stuck to the back of another journal by dried blood or some other substance, I found it more easily than I imagined. My husband's journal, written in the confident, bold handwriting I knew from birthday cards, notes on the refrigerator, and shopping lists. So another thing to note here about Vandermeer's skill with a written word. He could have just said, "My husband's journal, written in the confident, bold handwriting I knew." That's it. But what does he do? He adds some emotional weight to this stuff. Birthday cards, notes on the refrigerator, and shopping lists. He's bringing all of this imagery to really make us feel, because we can all identify with these things. But what does she see at the very end of this chapter? Emerging from that space was a foot and the end of a leg amid a flurry of disrupted sand. It was the psychologist. Man, I love that chapter. I'd love to hear what you think about this chapter, because it's by far my favorite chapter. It's like I said, it's so meditative. It's so personal. It gives us even a deeper look at the biologist. There's so much subtext there. There's so much symbolism. I could go on and on and on, but I'll save it to have a discussion with you. So let me know down in the comments how you're feeling. What was your favorite part? Was there anything that I didn't bring up? Was there some stuff that you didn't understand? I would love to help you figure it out if I can. Also, don't forget, join the Discord server if you're not already. It's completely free. We're having deep dives into this stuff. And I really look forward to seeing you in the next video with Immersion. And we only have 2 chapters left in this. I know they're long chapters, but we are almost done with this book. I should be getting this one out in a few days. So I will see you then in the next video.